Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Fagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably from theathletic.com. He is useful human Arif Hassan. Arif, have you started your big cat, multiple wives sex cult yet? Or are you waiting until all the Tiger King stuff blows over?
Yeah, I gotta make sure that my plans are distanced enough away from the release of the documentary so that I don't raise any suspicions.
$2,000 for a big cat. I didn't know. I could have had so many big cats.
Yeah, I think that's the problem.
Yeah, no, James, what you're actually showing is the point of the documentary.
For anyone who hasn't seen it, what are you doing? You have all the time in the world. Just watch it. It's the trashiest ride of your life. No one's ethical in it, including the documentarians. What are they doing? They should not have done this. Watch it. Support their work. Wild. It's one of those. You know how when people are like, "Hey, you should watch this show. You should watch this thing." It just gets crazier every minute. And it's like, yeah, kind of, maybe that's true. Like, McMillions got pretty crazy, 3 or 4 episodes in. It got pretty wild, honestly.
Really enjoyed that.
This Tiger King just ramps it up. Like, it drops you in a car already going 60. And then it just keeps accelerating and breaks, the land speed record. It's just wild. And it does that for 6 episodes. And then the 7th episode is, this abrupt denouement, and you're at the end and you're like, oh, I'm done. Holy crap. And it's just weird when the 7th episode ends because they try to end it and they're like, you should care about tigers at one point, and you're like, that's not what this documentary was trying to tell me.
that is not even the 30th thing that this thing is about.
Right? Don't get me wrong. Every single second I'm watching this documentary, I'm really sad about the tigers, but I'm also feeling 8 million other emotions. So let's not pretend this documentary was about how we should treat tigers better. No. It wasn't. It did a good job displaying that we should, but it wasn't.
This was not the tiger version of Blackfish. In no way. But we will actually talk about Tiger King here in a few minutes. So if you would like to hear our version, I was on Twitter, I had declared that this was going to be a review much like when we did the Return of the Rise of Skywalker, and we went an hour on it. we may need to go pretty in depth on this, so we'll talk about that in a little bit. But before we start, just want to thank you guys so much for listening, for joining us on Norse Code. If you enjoy the show and would like to donate to it to keep us ad free and to help keep the Loch Ness Monster at bay, you can do so in one of 2 different ways. You can go to paypal.me/Norse Code, or you can go to patreon.com/Norse Code and donate as well. Patreon has things like additional bonus episodes that we put up. We're not putting one up this week, but we will likely put one up after the next episode that we do. But just want to thank you guys so much. We have additional episodes up there, including additional clip shows that I put out every year as well. So if you would like more Norse Code, if you're thinking to yourself, I need to hear more of Arif, and you've already blown through the number of shows that he ends up on, which includes the NDSU show for some reason, or at least did this last week.
You
can go to patreon.com/Norse Code and go there. We just updated the page, so there is an RSS feed for those who are subscribed to the show and would like to put it into their podcast player of choice. So you don't have to log into Patreon to get the new episodes. You can just use whatever your aggregator is and do it there. So, I was testing that. I was like, wow, this is actually really easy to do. Fantastic. So go ahead and do that. It should work pretty easily. If there's any problems, just send a quick email to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com or just comment in the Patreon page as well, and I can take care of it there. We do have a new donation to speak of. Just want to thank Sam Ward for his donation to the show via Patreon. Again, thank you so much, Sam. And there's not a lot of Vikings news to talk about, but earlier today, Arif did an interview with Eric Eager, who is a data scientist over at PFF, also known as Pro Football Focus. So let's go over to the interview that Arif did earlier today with Eric.
Yeah, I'm here with Eric Eager, a data scientist of Pro Football Focus, Minnesota, native, and my good friend. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing well, man. I think this is the first time we've gotten together on a podcast, so much awaited, excited.
Yeah, much to my shame. I honestly thought we had done a podcast before. It could be so natural to do it, but callers had you on 80 times, and I haven't had you on once, so we had to fix that. I wanted to talk about. Actually, I just wanted you to defend me. Honestly, we were going to have a podcast scheduled for this week because in the off season we do every other week. But I got so heated about this mock draft that I wrote, and I should just let it go. But I decided instead to bring in a data scientist to defend my picks. Let's talk about PFF wins above replacement. And before we talk about how that applies to like mock drafts or whatever, what is it?
Yeah, so what we try to do is basically take the PFF grades, which I will admit can sometimes be a little confusing in the sense that, like, you know, if you have a 77 guard and a 74 wide receiver, like, does that mean those two players are equally valuable, or those two players add the same amount to their team? Or if you have a 60 grade over 1,000 snaps versus a 60 grade over 10 snaps, that kind of thing. So one of the things we wanted to do is put this in the currency that people care about, which is like, okay, wins and losses. And so, you know, over the course of the past few years, we've developed a way to take the play-by-play grades, adjust them for context, and then assign a win share basically for every player on each team. And, you know, so essentially you would say something like, you know, Anthony Harris was worth 0.6 wins to the Vikings last year over a practice squad safety, while Dalvin Cook was worth, I'm going to duck after this one, but like 0.15 or something like that. And so what it does is it positional value is a huge deal. Facet. So like we call these facets of play. So receiving, run blocking, pass blocking, things like that. Those are all, you know, sort of differently valuable. And what it allows us to do is take players who are sort of similarly good at different things and map that to how valuable it is to a team.
Cool. So let's talk about how that relates to kind of positional value when teams have to make decisions with finite resources, which is every time a team has to make a decision. So they get to choose in the first round of a draft, any particular team, doesn't have to be the Vikings, between, let's say they want to boost their offense between a receiver and a tackle, or if they want to boost their defense between a cornerback and an edge rusher. So all four of these players are considered very valuable by the NFL, by people who traditionally, you know, comment on the NFL. But when we talk about these players, we very often talk about how the three things you need on a team are quarterback, a guy who rushes the quarterback, and a guy who protects that quarterback from the rusher. But that's not what your data finds in terms of positional importance. Why is it that it seems like a receiver and a cornerback matter more to the respective sides of the ball than an edge rusher and a tackle, even though they're closer to the ball?
Yeah, that's always, you know, having, you know, growing up, we always heard the closer to the ball you are, the more valuable you are. And that would, you know, sort of imply that the smaller guys on the outside of the field are not as valuable and so on. And what we found is it's simply not true. And there's a couple reasons for that. And so one of them, you know, to break this down, one of them is simply that quarterbacks affect their pressure rates way more than we want to give them credit for. We always think of offensive linemen in this, you know, titanic struggle with defensive linemen to determine if, you know, the quarterback is clean on that play or pressured. But in reality, you know, it's very much how quickly the quarterback gets rid of the football, which is sort of a styles makes fight sort of like argument. But secondary to that, so you look, okay, so what's the key variable? The key variable is time to throw. And, you know, sort of what affects that? Well, what affects that is your receiver's ability to win early in the down. If your receivers can win early in the down, then the quarterback has the ability to get rid of the ball more quickly, and offensive line becomes less and less important. And then I think thirdly, you know, most offensive linemen can't win past 2.75 seconds anyway. And so there's really only a really thin window where offensive linemen sort of separate themselves. And as such, it's kind of the guys on the outside, how often they win, how variable can they win. And then it's really, as we all know, the quarterback really drives the whole thing in his ability either to move around and buy time for himself or get rid of the football, and avoid the question of whether or not his offensive linemen are beat altogether.
So this kind of brings up the question, because the way that you define this, obviously you're breaking it down in very simplistic terms. And so we're intentionally kind of trampling over a little bit of nuance. But the way it comes out is it makes it seem like, if you've got Tom Brady, who PFF likes, I think, a little bit more than kind of the second generation of statistics do, things like adjusted net yards per attempt and stuff. If you got Tom Brady and if you've got, let's say, DeAndre Hopkins, an expensive receiver that'd be very difficult to acquire.
Yep.
And you put him behind just like the worst offensive line, like a Tom Cable offensive line, that would be a much better offense than Tom Brady behind a pristine offensive line, like a Dante Scarnecchia offensive line. And he's throwing to, say, Hakeem Butler and Andy Isabella, the people that are getting replaced by DeAndre Hopkins. Like, that offense is, in theory, much worse, or is it because there's 5 offensive linemen? I'm kind of skewing the data to make it seem weird.
Well, and I think you walked yourself into, sort of what we saw last year. I'm kind of looking. I mean, Houston kind of had that last year. They had Hopkins and Fuller, and Fuller really drove a lot of the explosiveness in that offense, and an offensive line that wasn't particularly good. I mean, Tunzel was fine, but that's not an offensive line replete with great players. And, Deshaun Watson, who by hook or by crook, that offense averaged, 5.7 yards per play last year. I'm looking at net adjusted yards per attempt. They're still higher than the Patriots there. The Patriots were a team that, I wouldn't say had the best talent on offensive line, but certainly had Dante Scarnecchia. They had Tom Brady, but they didn't have receivers who could separate. And as a result, their offense really struggled. So, I would say that the Houston offense in the first, circumstances you talked about where receivers can separate, receivers can get open, are sort of more valuable than a second offense, which has a pristine offensive line. But no one to throw to. The classic example I sort of give, and again, all of these, as you said, are simplifications just to try to make a point. But you look at, probably one of the best offenses in Minnesota Vikings history was the 2009 group with Brett Favre, one of the better offensive line collections to ever play for the team. Sidney Rice, they average 29 points a game. Sidney Rice goes down with a hip injury in the NFC Championship game, and he doesn't play until it's too late in 2010. And that offense only averaged like 18 points a game the following year. Again, when you don't have options to throw to and your guys can't win, like that extra quarter of a second certainly matters, but not nearly as much as the separation that a wide receiver can generate on the second level of the play.
All right, well, then let's talk about how it applies to this year's draft. So this is all like a great discussion to have, especially with regards to free agency, but it is not necessarily 100% transformable to something like the draft, where you've got, I think, much more available talent to you, especially at the bottom of the first round at receiver, than you do along the offensive line. And so the issue that the readers had was not that receiver or offensive line is necessarily more important, although there are people that thought that, grabbing a tackle or a guard was actually just a one-to-one, a better investment than a receiver, which is not something that really aligns with the data, but rather that the drop-off in play from receiver from the bottom of the first round to the bottom of the second round, where the Vikings pick again, was simply just much smaller than the drop-off in play from tackle at 25 and tackle at 58. And so when you take that into account, so in theory, neither of these players in round 1 or round 2 would be replacement level players. You'd kind of hope that they would start. But in theory, because there's a smaller drop-off at receiver, you're dealing with just a very small magnitude in the change in, say, wins above replacement at receiver in order to get a relatively large magnitude, in theory, along the offensive line.
Yep.
Is that something that fits or no?
Well, yeah, and that's the tricky part. So what I found is that, for one, offensive line is sort of a weak link system. So the benefits that you get in going from, let's say, Riley Reef to Tyron Smith are not nearly as high as if you go from TJ Clemmings to Riley Reef. Um, there, because so many other things have to work out in order for you to see the benefits of elite tackle play. Whereas wide receiver is more of a strong link system where one player or the top two players can really move the needle. And so, I agree. I agree with it, with the fact that the wide receiver group after the first three guys or so is pretty flat. But I don't think that the drop off, the offensive production function is that sensitive with respect to the change in tackle. And going from one of the upper tier guys to one of maybe a second or third round guy. Even if the talent disparity is higher than that at wide receiver, I don't think the offensive production as a result would move the needle that much more.
Okay. So I'm right and everyone else is wrong. That's really great to hear. One thing that also I think kind of comes up that's kind of interesting is, I think, this question of cornerback. So cornerback is traditionally, I think, given PFF's metrics, a very unstable position.
Yep.
And it is difficult year to year to predict how a cornerback will do. But I think I saw, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think I saw something that indicated that a college player's cornerback grade projects better to a rookie year or career cornerback grade for a prospect than any single year in the NFL does. Is that right? Is that wrong?
I think so. That must have been a study that either Kevin or Timo did that I read over once. But well, I will say this. I think, like, if you're looking at cornerback play, any one NFL season is pretty noisy, so unless it's something fundamental that you can point out, say like Xavier Rhodes' like lack of athleticism that over the past few years, a lot of it is just noise season to season, where a guy plays well one year, circumstances change or things are different the following year, and it's not quite as good. But since college over the course of it, is more snaps, I can see that being true. So, but in any event, the issue with cornerback is, as you said, that it's just more noisy, right? So if you're deciding whether to draft Jeffrey Okudah or Chase Young, I'm far more confident that Chase Young is going to be the player that you draft at number 2. I just don't know necessarily if that is going to be more as valuable, just given the numbers you need in the secondary, as well as the limitations of a great pass rusher in terms of the number of plays they affect per game.
So, given that, do you think that teams should be much more aggressive about drafting multiple corners in a draft, even if they don't necessarily, need multiple corners?
Yeah, I mean, it's why I really thought that the draft pick of Mike Hughes was one of the better ones, that they've made in Minnesota in some time, because it was something where the system hadn't yet broken, but once it did, it was pretty apparent that there was a need quickly, right? When Rhodes started losing his fastball, Mackenzie Alexander got hurt, Trey Waynes kind of went up and then went down. Hughes ended up being a piece that they needed there. So I think with we've shown that it's very much a weak link system. So not only do you need talent at the position, but you need depth, because the offense gets to dictate where they throw it to. You can't really hide defensive backs all that well. There are some schemes that do it better than others, but you can't hide defensive backs all that well. So they better be good.
Why does trading down seem to be so much more analytically sound than trading up just generally speaking in the draft?
Well, I just think it's the curve is a lot flatter. The value curve with respect to draft position is so much flatter. You don't get it's not exponential. It's exponential in a sense, but the coefficients are so small. The second player in the draft is not half as good as the first player in the draft, and the third. And we've seen studies. Nobel Prize winner Richard Thaler and Cade Massey said it's like basically a 52-48 proposition that the next player in the draft at his position will be worse than the player in front of him at his position. So it's just the 20th pick is not all that much different than the 15th pick, and so but that's not how they're priced. I mean, if you want to trade up 5 picks in the first round, you're going to have to give up a hefty price, and those are all coins that are basically similarly similarly weighted, essentially.
And let's talk a little bit about kind of the safety question that's been, I don't know, not plaguing the Vikings, but kind of revolving around this offseason. So the Vikings franchise Anthony Harris and seemingly intend to trade him, but they haven't found a trade partner willing to pay what I assume is a second-round pick for a guy on a 1-year contract. At the Combine, Mike Zimmer said, hey, if he's a great player, and if he gets his money, I'm really happy for him. But honestly, if you stacked up the positions by importance on the defense, safety is not at the top. And in a strict sense, based off of your evidence, that's true. It's cornerback. But in kind of a broad interpreting what he says sense, he's clearly not saying it's one of the 3 most important either, where I think it might be because it's a coverage position. Why is there such a disconnect? And like, this is true when you take a look at the draft. Safeties don't tend to get drafted that high. This is true when you take a look at the Hall of Fame. It's much more difficult for a safety to enter the Hall of Fame. Why is there such a disconnect between the way that we think about safeties in particular? Because people say cornerbacks aren't that important, but you draft them at like 3 overall still.
Yeah.
Why is there that disconnect at safety?
Well, I don't know if people I think that Zimmer must appreciate what Harrison Smith does to his defense, right? The fact that he can do so many things, it sort of keeps players who are weaker, sort of like the Robert Blantons and the who is it before him? The Jamarcus Sanfords and the Andrew Sendejos, right? Those guys are very limited players, but when you have a player, so in Kansas City, Tyrann Mathieu comes in and he can play deep, he can play in the box, he can play slot, and so on. So then players who were exposed in Bob Sutton's system, Daniel Sorensen, for example, are only asked to do one thing because Matthew can sort of fill all those other things. And then your weak links become less weak. And so Zimmer must, I don't think he thinks of Harrison Smith that way. He must just think of Anthony Harris that way, which is, it could be fair. He's only been asked, I think, to play that deep role during the last year and a half with Minnesota. But I would sort of disagree, just because I think if you don't make plays like that, I mean, we saw in the Kansas City game, Damian Williams absolutely shook Anthony Harris in the hole. And that was you talk about expected points play, that's probably like 8 expected points right there, right? If he makes that tackle, it's not. So there's so much high leverage with that position that, there's a lot of value there, and just being, and oftentimes we only see that value in a sort of negative sense. If things don't happen, or if things don't break down in the defense. Whereas, with, for example, pass rusher, we always see the positive thing. We see the wins that a pass rusher has more than anything. It might just be our perception skewing the reality.
So one of the things that ESPN studied, to get back to this pass rusher question, that the ESPN study on pass block win rate demonstrated is that pass blockers might be more important than we think. I think was like the title of the article, or a podcast talking about the article or something. And it talked a little bit about what you mentioned, that it's about time to throw is kind of the key metric. It's not about pressure, because, a defensive lineman can win and not have a pressure. They can beat the offensive tackle. The quarterback knows that's happening. They get rid of the ball on a slant instead of waiting for, a hitch or a deeper route to open. That's great, but is that kind of incorporated into the way that, you've been generating PFF WAR? Is something like pass block win rate something PFF also tracks? Is that something that you've studied? And is it, again, kind of the same offensive linemen give you latitude to do more sort of thing?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we chart blocks beaten and so a guy can get a negative grade without giving up a pressure, if the ball is thrown quickly, and vice versa. So there's certainly so I would say that those two metrics track pretty well with each other. The issue, I think, with ESPN's metric is it doesn't adjust for some circumstances that our graders adjust for, say like, play action, which, just gives an offensive lineman like a half a free second, generally speaking. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I would just say that their research maybe just suggests that pass rush isn't as important as people think it is, because, the majority of the time these guys are winning 20% of their snaps anyway. And those other 80% of snaps, somebody else has got to win. And even in the 20% of snaps you win, a lot of those plays end up being positive anyway. So coverage ends up being the more important thing. But that's kind of what I gleaned from their study.
Okay. Is there maybe a coverage version of this where you don't get the target, but you win, so you deter the target? Because I know the way PFF grades coverage is, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, is when they're targeted in coverage, that's when an opportunity for a gradable snap occurs. And so they either win with a pass deflection, or they push someone to the sideline, create a difficult window, the ball falls incomplete. That's positive, or they allow a completion, or whatever, right? Maybe they're in a good position and the quarterback fits a super tight window and it doesn't hurt their grade. And then on every other snap that they're not targeted, my understanding is that they get kind of a uniform boost for every snap. Just a small, every snap they're not targeted, they get a boost. But is there maybe a version of that where if you had instant access to all 22 and you're grading off of that instead, you'd be able to say, hey, his coverage win rate is this or that, because he was able to kind of deter a throw that would have been there that wasn't there before, whereas somebody who gets burned but the quarterback checks down because they didn't see it, that doesn't project well. Is there a way to generate a coverage version of that?
Yeah, it's more labor intensive, but we have started to do that at the NFL level in one of our all 22 processes. But yeah, the way so it's not necessarily uniformly applied to non-coverage players, but it's not specifically applied to every individual player. So there's like a normalization, for example, like let's say you're a left cornerback and the quarterback has to hold the ball for 3 seconds and he doesn't target you and he comes off of his first read, then you're going to get a positive grade, a small positive grade. Whereas if if he throws in 2.2 seconds to somebody else on his first read, you basically get nothing. So it's sort of, it's not as blunt, it's not as blunt as just giving everybody a 0 and adjusting, but it's also not perfectly, hey, we're watching, until this year, it wasn't as blunt as like, every single player is getting sort of, a specific grade for how they did.
Okay. And then let's rope it back around to the Vikings. So the Vikings have made a bunch of confusing moves this offseason. You've talked about it on Twitter. I've written about it. They don't seem to have a direction. Yeah, fine, whatever. We've litigated it. With that in mind, what do you think the best approach for the Vikings is in this draft? Should they trade out of the first round, acquire a bunch of developmental picks, and hope that they can reload for a 2022 run? Should they trade up for a quarterback if they're available? Maybe Justin Herbert's there at 17, you trade up for him. And you'll lose a lot of capital to do that, but it's a quarterback, and that's kind of one of the few instances where that trade up is kind of worth it. Or should they try to get as many instant impact rookies, knowing that we might not have an off season because of a pandemic?
Yeah, that's a good point. I more lean towards the first thing if they're not going to have as robust of an off season, just because, a lot of the football game is mental. And even if a guy is physically ready, putting all your eggs in that one basket, it doesn't seem, good given all the issues that they have around their roster. I'm not particularly enamored with Jordan Love or Justin Herbert, so I don't know if I would spend the capital to move up now. If he falls into the late 20s, maybe, but not before 20. I wouldn't move up to take one of those two guys. I'd let somebody else sort of roll that dice. But I don't know. I do like the trade back situation. The only issue is some of their moves have implied that they're still trying to at least win some games in 2020. And like, I think moving back would send, a message that they're not, which is kind of, I would imagine, what you and I both think they should do. But, extending Cousins, Michael Pierce, signing him to a deal, not having a terrible amount of cap room, probably, franchise tagging Anthony Harris without trading him, all that kind of stuff sort of implies that they're still trying to keep one leg in, and trading back would sort of pull that leg out, but you still have Kirk Cousins. So I don't know. I would anything that sort of implies more of a rebuild situation, I'm all for. I think trading back, would be the key there.
Let's say the Vikings can't trade. I don't know why. Ziggy Wolf just told him you can't. It's very much like a draft day scenario. The owner's meddling for whatever reason. And the Vikings can't trade. What are your ideal first and second round picks for the Vikings in order for them to accomplish whatever goal you think that they should accomplish, given the fact that they cannot trade?
That's a great. So let me stay consistent with my own mock draft here. So in the first version of the mock draft, so I had them taking Ashton Davis from Cal. Now he might be available in the second round. I do think that if they do move on from Anthony Harris or even Harrison Smith, which I've suggested before via trade, I think he would be a player.
Has that gone over well, saying we should move on from Harrison Smith?
Well, I brought it up right when the pandemic started. People are saying, Eric, you keep saying what the Vikings shouldn't do. What should they do? And I said, well, and I obviously this is a little tongue in cheek, but the Vikings are in a situation where Harrison Smith has still got the name power. He probably is worth at least a top end of the second round pick. And he's still, he's one of their players that they could get assets for. And I don't know when they come out of this rebuild if he's going to be young enough to help them,
Okay, well, the second question then, I'm going to cut you off, sorry, because this is such an interesting question. What distinguishes Harrison Smith in that scenario from Adam Thielen?
I think Harrison Smith is better.
Okay, but I mean, it sounds like you should still trade Adam Thielen then too.
Yeah. I mean, so
I don't understand what would prevent you from doing both.
Right. I mean, well, and one of my favorite documentaries was the Football Life on Jimmy Johnson when he first floated the idea of trading Herschel Walker, and somebody said, "Well, he's your only player." And he's like, that's the point. Like, we don't have any good players. And so I almost threw right back, but he's their only wide receiver. And I guess you would come back and say, well, that's the point. Right. Because I agree. And it just depends. I mean, Thielen is coming. So here's the thing. I mean, Harrison Smith, after a kind of a down 2018, is coming off of a pretty damn good, 2019 season. Thielen is coming off of a down year this year, which would be sort of like my only, they may not be able to get the top end value for him in a trade would be my only retort, but I don't hate it. So as such, I also in our analytics mock, again, we take a lot of wide receivers here, but I had the Vikings with the Buffalo pick taking T. Higgins, and then Cameron Dantzler, who I know has been kind of falling on the boards because of his slow 40 at the combine. But he's got that length.
Running it, man. I don't know if that's a Zimmer corner.
Well, but he's big though, right? And Zimmer kind of likes those big physical guys. That'd be my only, because he's like 6'2", yeah.
Yeah. And so Xavier Rhodes, but Xavier Rhodes ran a 4.42 on one day in his life. Yeah. So
right, and that was and I put a decent amount of stock in him being a good player in the SEC. If you're slow. The SEC, if you're truly slow as a player, the SEC is going to find you out, type of thing.
Do you think that the DeAndre Baker's going to end up being good then? Same situation, right? Really good.
It is. Well, and he was really bad in year one for the New York Giants. So that's a good point. I would say a lot of these guys are pretty just scheme dependent, right? So. Mm-hmm. It could be, if somebody, so he might not be a great player for Zimmer's scheme, but you also, if you're Spielman, you got to be thinking, in the future, possibly having a different coach too, right? And you just drafting for talent type of thing. But yeah, that's a good point. Another, second round. I mean, it just depends upon where a lot of these guys go. Like Matt Peart of UConn. He might be gone by the time they go in the second round, but he looks pretty good in, our college to pro sort of projection system. Yeah, just
Well,
I would.
let me ask a little bit about T. Higgins because I have been pretty underwhelmed by him. I know part of the reason that the Vikings pick him at 22 in your mock is because like just receivers just go
Yep.
in your analytics mock because of everything that we've just discussed. And so if we assume that 4 receivers are gone by the time the Vikings pick, and then they pick T. Higgins, is that a dramatic misstep? Because I know he's not like the 5th receiver that you have, obviously by the mock, but I've seen T. Higgins mocked to the Vikings kind of more and more over the past week. Can you convince me? I'm not the 31-inch vertical for a receiver of his size and his play style.
Four,
Seems,
4.57. He had a lot of air yards in college, but he didn't convert necessarily on a lot of. And if you bet his over props in the national title game, I don't know who would. You got kind of stolen there. No, I'm not exact. He's not the most impressive of the receivers. I mean, I would consider Denzel Mims certainly. I think is a better prospect. Justin Jefferson, although he's a little bit limited because we don't have a ton of data of him, or maybe any data of him playing on the outside. Chenault's a player I'm not enamored with, but some of the people I respect like a lot. Rager's another one. Those guys might all be gone, but I prefer all those guys to Higgins. It's just that in our mock, Higgins is just the next best receiver up there when the time comes. So no, I mean he, some of his fundamentals are not the greatest in terms of, as you said, the athleticism scores are not there. Converting air yards to actual receiving yards is not impressive at all.
you're doing a terrible job of selling me on this guy.
Yeah. But I do think, like, as far as, in terms of playing wide receiver in the NFL, I think gone are the days where you draft a guy in the first round, like a la Troy Williamson, and expect him to replace a number one bona fide, right? Like most of these guys are kind of, Calvin Ridley, DJ Moore. You draft them to do the one or two things they do well, and then you find that's why what the Vikings are doing at receiver is so maddening because they don't have any depth there. But you sort of draft and then you platoon those guys, in a full functioning offense.
Sure. Let's go back to this is something we were talking about before we started recording. Do you think we have an off season? How many games, if not, how many games does the NFL play? When the NFL plays games, and this is somebody asked, something somebody asked in the mailbag, if the NFL does play games, will stadiums sell out on a regular basis? And how does a limited NFL schedule kind of change things in your mind? So that's like 4 questions, but I think you can handle it.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, so when this all started to go down, just full disclosure, I was scouring the betting markets looking for probabilities because obviously a lot of our livelihood deals, is dependent upon them actually playing football games come September. And it looked like at least a week ago, the NBA, NHL, and Major League Baseball were basically 20%. 20 to 30% probability to start before June 1st. I think that's probably gone down quite a bit. It's no longer available. It was less than even money, so about 45% chance that they would start before July 1st. And then they were above even money, so something like 50 to 60, 55, 65% to start before August 1st. So that was
okay.
So that
Sorry, that interacts with the NFL in almost a perfect way.
Exactly. Well, so that was my thing. So in my impression is that if NBA, MLB, or NHL are playing games in August, the NFL will probably be fine. And as of a week ago, the betting markets, which are fairly pessimistic about these things. I mean, if you look, if you follow things like the price of Bitcoin or something like that, they're usually, fairly pessimistic about things that we're generally more optimistic about, or the market is. So I would say, that the NFL would have a season, I think is probably 75%. Now I would probably put it more around 50% that fans get to attend games. And I'm a little bit more bearish on it now than I was, say, a week ago. And and my biggest concern as somebody who used to study epidemiology for a living is if we don't have a secondary infection or a secondary outbreak until June, and then we have one in June or July, then I think that throws the entire thing off. So I don't know, if you're listening now, take social distancing seriously. Encourage your friends and your weird uncles and grandparents to do it as well. Because if we take social distancing seriously for 2-3 months, I think that the chances are substantially higher. If we bail out on it after a month because we're worried about the economy, then the chance of a second outbreak, and a second outbreak would completely screw things, are a lot higher.
And there's historical precedent for that. The Spanish flu had a second outbreak in the fall as well.
Right, and that's the thing. I mean, and that would be a nightmare scenario for the NFL, would be to have a summer where things were encouraging, and then a second outbreak while the season happened, because that would basically shut the whole thing down, full stop. And I have to imagine that the NFL, although they didn't say this in their press conference this week, which is a little troubling, I got to think that the NFL is putting together a contingency for quarantine players, essential media members, and staff, because that would be to me what I would be spending my time doing if I was a executive in the NFL, would be finding a way that even if things were bad, having the opportunity to sort of say, okay, well, only essential people are there. We're going to test every single person every single day. If you get coronavirus, you're out for X weeks. But we're still going to play these games. We're going to keep our, honor our TV contracts, all that kind of stuff. And we're just not going to have fans. And we're going to take a hit this year, but, we're going to serve the public by keeping them inside and giving them something to be entertained by, I guess.
What is the minimum number of games the NFL needs to play for there to be a season?
Well, our only precedent was 1982 when they played 9 in the strike shortened year. And then they basically made it around, they basically took away divisions and all that kind of stuff. Made a sort of a 9-team playoff or something team playoff. I would say 8. But I'm sort of the belief that I have a hard time seeing the season starting in November if it already hasn't started in September. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think that I think that either things are taken care of by then or they're not. But I could be wrong. It's sort of like with the Olympics that they basically moved it back an entire year, knowing that they couldn't, make it work, during the scheduled time, which kind of sucks, but it might be the reality that we face.
All right. Well, sorry for ending on a relatively somber note. But,
I said 75-25, so I think that's still a pretty optimistic.
All right. Yeah. Super optimistic ending note about the pandemic. Thanks so much for coming on. Where can people find you? What's the most recent stuff you've written? Is there anything else you want to plug, etc.?
Well, PFF_Eric is where I'm at on Twitter. I just wrote an article about why betting the Vikings under 9 wins might be a good emotional hedge for the people here.
That's not the reason you think it's just a good bet. You don't. I do think
it's a good bet. If you look at their schedule of quarterbacks faced, it's not going to.
Matt Ryan, Dak. We don't need to spend too much time on this. Matt Ryan, Dak Prescott, Drew Brees, I guess Aaron Rodgers, Matthew Stafford. I think is flying under the radar as a member of that group that could really hurt the Vikings. Tom Brady, apparently.
Deshaun Watson, Phillip Rivers.
Phillip Rivers.
Russell Wilson.
But that's every year.
I mean they really. Last season, I think one of the under the radar things the Vikings got was they got to play Kyle Allen, David Blau, Chase Daniel, Matt Moore,
that one,
Case Keenum. They really got a nice little schedule of quarterbacks last season, and I don't know if that happens this year. That being said, Zimmer has always kept the Vikings within arm's length of 9 wins, so it's not going to be a cinch. I don't see the Vikings going 4-12. I just am a little bit pessimistic about how they're going to be able to perform this year.
Okay. Sorry, that was supposed to be a sign-off. PFF_Eric, he's fantastic. One of the things that I like to do is to take a look at the evidence, see what it says about football and other stuff, but mostly football. and I mostly cribbed from Eric. So follow him so you don't have to read my stuff, and read his article about why you should emotionally hedge, but also probably make money by betting the under on the Vikings over at pff.com.
Let's go to the mailbag, and the first question is from Thomas, who asks, in your most recent podcast, you speculated on whether players want to stay with the Vikings, and you also noted the complaints that departing Lions had about Lions coach Matt Patricia. Given the apparent unhappiness of some former members of the Viking secondary, do you think that the departure of coaches George Edwards and Jerry Gray affected players' decisions to sign elsewhere?
Yeah, I don't think the George Edwards departure had much to do with any of that, but I would not be shocked if the Jerry Gray decision to sign elsewhere did. The thing is, these are all players that I anticipated would not be with the Vikings, right? Like Xavier Rhodes, he was an easy cut. Trey Waynes was going to be too expensive. And Mackenzie Alexander already had his grievances with the Vikings, in part because they asked him to play in Week 17 when he was already injured and aggravated that injury and was forced to miss the playoffs, despite the fact that no other starters were playing Week 17. Plus, he's always kind of wanted a chance to play on the outside, and the Vikings didn't give him that chance. That has nothing to do with Jerry Gray leaving, and in fact, might even be a product of Jerry Gray being with the Vikings. So those defenders probably don't have much to do with Jerry Gray. And Jaron Kearse, it really felt like, he didn't think that he was going to be with the Vikings and he wanted to leave the Vikings. And I don't think that is because he suspected that Jerry Gray would be leaving at the end of the season. So it'd be easy to say that. And I wouldn't be shocked if it had a role in some way. But it really, I don't think any of that is a primary factor for anybody. And I don't think George Edwards is a primary factor for anybody. And we also had a related question about locker room concerns is, whether or not we should think about, whether or not that exists. And I don't know. It's tough to say because, this is the same locker room that, Anthony Barr came back to. This is the same, locker room that's attracted high profile free agents over the years. So I don't know. It's a difficult one to figure out because with Matt Patricia, at least, players are very vocal in how much they dislike him, right? With Mike Zimmer, when a player leaves, they're not really trashing him, and players are still re-signing with the Vikings. They're still, choosing to sign with the Vikings as new players. So it doesn't really seem like it's as big a deal as, a team that has like a real problem with that sort of thing.
Also another question from Thomas is, I doubt that anyone expected to see the Vikings re-signing so many offensive veteran backup players like Abdullah, Jones, Dozier, and Hill, but could they be worrying about the canceled OTAs and shortened training camp preparation time for rookies? These veterans already know the Kubiak-Dennison system. Also, do the new veteran minimum salary guidelines offer salary cap advantages for signing the veteran players?
So I'll answer the second question first. The new veteran minimum salary guidelines do, but in the same way that the old CBA did. So whenever you sign someone to a veteran minimum and they were I think a 6-year veteran or longer, you'd end up signing them for $700,000, $800,000, $900,000. I think, Dakota Dozier might have signed for the veteran minimum of $1 million or something like that, or $960,000. But their salary cap hit is substantially less, something closer to $500,000, $600,000. That's been true in the last CBA. That's true in the new CBA, but it does increase what the price of that veteran minimum is. So in some small sense, it might give some advantages that weren't there before because maybe, the difference between what they would have gotten in free agency and the new veteran minimum they would have get here is small enough that they prefer to play here. Or, if they're considering retirement, playing for $1 million instead of $800,000 might be kind of the thing that lets you push on for another year. So I don't think that there's a huge difference, but it does offer salary cap advantages for signing veteran players. And then back to the prior question, do you think re-signing these offensive veteran backups has anything to do worrying about canceled OTAs? Eric and I talked about kind of how there's just going to be a short amount of time, potentially, and in all likelihood, to teach rookies, the new system and everything like that. And we had a question about that in the mailbag too. I don't think that had much to do with re-signing these players. Honestly, I think they would have done it in either scenario. In fact, I projected, I think, 3 of these 4 signings in my first offseason blueprint, where I think the only player I didn't re-sign was Dozier, just because I didn't particularly think that he was all that great with the Vikings, but I totally could see it Brett Jones is somebody that I would like for the Vikings to play at guard, but they like him a lot at center. Hill is an easy re-signing. Abdullah makes sense because he's a returner and also potentially offers insurance against the Dalvin Cook lockout. So I think those all make sense. I don't think that has much to do with the potential for lost practice time and lost teaching time.
Next question is from John Belk, who asks, every time I see a free agency deal that would have been of great value to the Vikings, Dunbar, Poole, Balaga, etc., I wonder why the Vikings didn't offer just slightly more, since free agency is supposed to be an open market system, and I have to assume the Vikings at least kick the tires on all these players. Is it less of an open market than people assume? Are the Vikings so picky that they don't even consider most free agents, or is there something else I'm missing?
I think that there's kind of a mixture here. So I think that I don't know what you mean by less of an open market, but I would not conceive of free agency as a situation where a player puts their name out and everyone individually considers whether or not they want that player, and then they begin negotiations with that player, and they negotiate with 30 different teams or whatever. So in that sense, no. But any team is willing to kind of inquire to an agent. The thing is, I think we don't really understand all the incentives, or at least incorporate all the incentives that players have when it comes to picking a team. So players might want to pick a team that there's a previous relationship with a coach or a player that they were teammates with, that they want to spend time with, because this is your job and you want to choose your job environment, and so that narrows down the list of teams. Or maybe you don't want to pick a team that you think is likely to lose a lot of games this year, right? And so that leaves off a lot of teams. Or you want to pick a team that's going to win games, and so that leaves off a lot of teams. And teams are not going to contact you if they don't think you're a system fit, right? Or if they don't have a need at that position, and that's the position that you play. And so in like the context of like these guys, Quentin Dunbar, Poole, Balaga, right tackle, I think Poole and Dunbar, they were needs because they're slot corners. Balaga is kind of, because he's a right tackle, I don't know that the Vikings were as interested in him. Obviously, again, you can push Browning to the left, you can push Riley Reef inside, and maybe that would have all kind of worked out. But that didn't strike me as surprising, honestly, that the Vikings didn't go in on him. More interesting to me was the Quentin Dunbar, Brian Poole thing. Both of them, I think, were re-signings. So unless I'm mistaken on Quentin Dunbar, which I'll just look that up right now. But Brian Poole, he re-signed to the Jets. Quentin Dunbar, Quentin Dunbar wanted out of Washington, so he's with the Seahawks. Quentin Dunbar, I don't know. I think that he would have been a great system fit. I don't know if the Vikings contacted him. I don't know kind of what the deal with that is. But that's kind of one of the areas where you think, hey, the Vikings probably should have done something, or Dunbar really likes kind of the situation in Seattle, so he was willing to listen for offers for substantially less for whatever reason. Every time this happens, I wouldn't say that the Vikings kind of screwed up just because the Vikings might just not have been in the running. But how college recruits get 60 offers and they have to narrow it down to 5 pretty quickly, just so they can kind of keep sane. I think that in order for players to be able to make decisions about where they go in free agency, they have to quickly narrow down the list of teams that they want to sign with, and then communicate that to their agent, and then their agent communicates that with teams, just so that they have the mental capacity to be able to end up making that decision, because it's so difficult to try and sort through 30 options. So I think that also plays a role.
Raul asks, Vikings, who would you rather? Number 1, offensive lineman, Josh Jones or Cesar Ruiz?
I would take Jones. I think I'm kind of surprised that Ruiz has ended up in the bottom of the first round. Now, I think he's a really good player, but he strikes me as a guy that's likely center only that could flex to guard, whereas Jones is a tackle that is being talked about as if he's a guard. Not only is that more valuable, I think it kind of fits what the Vikings need a little bit more. If we don't like the job that Bradbury is doing, I think Brett Jones fills in. I think he's a starting quality center, so you don't have to worry about that. At guard, maybe Ruiz plays there and it works out for him. Maybe he can only play center. with Josh Jones, we know that he can play tackle, and a lot of people suspect, I think, very strongly and very accurately that he can play guard. I think that you resolve a situation with Josh Jones with a lot more certainty, and I think he's also just a better player. He's a better athlete, which, Ruiz is a pretty good athlete, but Jones is a really great athlete, and he plays a more valuable position, potentially at tackle. So I would much rather Josh Jones.
Also, there's a question of who would you rather for defensive ends, AJ Epinesa or Yetur Gross-Matos?
Just threw some pronunciation curveballs at you, huh?
I Googled that one. NFL.com says that's exactly how to pronounce that.
Sure. I won't pronounce it like that. Because to me, in my head, it's Gross-Matos. But that's who I would take. I'd take the Penn State guy over the Iowa guy, AJ Epinesa, just because I think that he's got more flexibility and more athleticism and the capability of translating into an NFL system a little bit better. I think Epinesa is a really great player, but I think he's really phenomenal for college. I don't know if that translates as well to the NFL. He's a power-only kind of guy, which, sometimes that works. I mean, I've been talking about starting a Fadi Odenigbo, and he's mostly a power guy, right? So it's not as if, that doesn't work. But I just don't think he's got as much agility or bend as Gross-Matos. So I would rather have the Penn State kid because I think he's got more capability to do the things that end up translating well in the NFL as a pass rusher.
Also, after Okudah and Henderson, there's said to be a significant drop-off at corner. Can any of these safety prospects cover man-to-man? Is someone like Winfield Jr., hey, I can pronounce that, a better option than the 3rd/10th corner on the board?
I wouldn't say that there's a significant drop-off. In fact, I don't even think Henderson is in that tier with Okudah, and I would say Christian Fulton's in that tier. Or Okudah's in his own tier, and then it's Christian Fulton, and then after that, I would say Henderson and so on. But Henderson is getting mocked around 16 now, so people seem to really love him. I'm not as high on him as I think a lot of people are. But I think that when you take a look at Christian Fulton and Jeff Gladney and some of those cornerbacks in the 2nd, 3rd tier, I think you end up with actually a pretty good set of cornerbacks. I think, it can drop off, but I really like Damon Arnett. I like the Auburn guy whose name I can't pronounce. I don't think there's that huge of a drop-off. That said, there are a lot of safeties actually in this class, I think uniquely in this class, that can cover man-to-man really well. And so that's going to be part of the consideration. But most of those players, you're really only going to have them in the slot. So you're not really comparing these players to boundary corners, right? You're comparing them to slot corners. So which obviously, that's what you'd want Winfield to do. And then we missed Trayvon Diggs, who I've seen recently mocked to the Vikings. I find that kind of interesting. Courtney Cronin mocked him to the Vikings. And she obviously is familiar with the situation involving Trayvon Diggs. So I'm kind of curious about that. And if he's on the table, that's something to think about. And I also forgot AJ Terrell from Clemson, who's also, I think, kind of in that group. Jalen Johnson from Utah, a little bit in that group as well. But you take a look at, these man coverage safeties. Ashton Davis can do it. Antoine Winfield can do it. I think at a pretty high level. Not Kyle Duggar so much, not Grant Delpete so much, but you can go down to Jeremy Chin. I think Terrell Burgess has some capability of doing it. There's Kayvon Wallace, who I've mocked to the Vikings, 1 or 2 times, I think has the ability to cover man-to-man. Some of these Notre Dame guys have the ability to cover man-to-man. I think, Alohi Gilman can do it. I think at the Senior Bowl, the other Notre Dame safety did it a little bit. He wasn't as good, and I think that his film is not as great covering man-to-man. But there's a lot more safeties that cover in-man coverage in the slot, I think, better than you'd expect in this particular draft class that normally play safety. So I wouldn't say Winfield is better at corner than, say, grabbing AJ Terrell or the Auburn corner, Noah Boheen. Just going to say that that's his name now. But it's something to consider, especially if you're thinking about, especially in the slot, if you're thinking about Trajan Bandy from Miami or Troy Pride from Notre Dame or Darnell Holmes from UCLA. If you're thinking about them as maybe slot corners, then you maybe want to say, hey, I don't know, maybe Ashton Davis is a better cover corner in the slot than those guys.
Next question is from Luke Braun, who asks, what are the worst draft content commenters? My most hated is that player won't make it that far, in response to a simulation where he has made it that far.
Yeah, I mean, that's up there. I despise that one because I especially do the work to make sure that it's reasonable that player is there. So it's not just in a simulation, but, I take a look at kind of where that player goes on average in mock drafts, something that's very easy to do now because of Grinding the Mocks that Benjamin Robinson has put together at grindingthemocks.com. And I'm sorry, but like all of the data that we have available to us says that he will make it there. Sometimes I get a genuine question like, why do people think Ben Barch is going to go that high? It was one question that I got in response to a mock that I posted. And, I responded, well, you take a look at Ali Marpet, another Division III guy that was a super athlete, did well at the Combine, did super well at the Senior Bowl. Barch did the same thing, and he's really improved as a technical player over the past couple of weeks. So, he's going in the fourth round in a lot of these mocks. Ali Marpet went in the second. You never know. And that explanation worked. It was kind of a genuine kind of fact finding. But a lot of people are just like, Tyler Johnson's not going to make it to the fourth. And it's like, maybe not, but like, it's reasonable to assume that he would. It's very obnoxious. But I don't really like it when I give the parameters of a mock draft and people complain that I didn't do something that's outside of the parameters. That bothers me. So in my most recent mock, I selected players that were only at that rank or lower in the Grinding the Mocks mock draft aggregation tool. And so they were like, wow, you reached on every single player. And it's like, yeah, obviously. I can't pick a player that's better than the Vikings drafted, pick slot, right? Like, I have to reach on every player. Duh. Like, there's no question.
Like you're missing the point. The point of this is to read. In the first sentence, I explained what I was doing.
Right. Or you should have traded. And I was like, I said I wasn't going to trade in this mock. Most of the mocks that you read don't have trades in them. Come on, man. Or, you should have picked, this player, this player, this player. And it's like, well, if you read the parameters, I'm only picking players that met the Vikings thresholds at the whatever. And I've linked all of those players in these past two articles, and the player you mentioned is not within the Vikings threshold. So I didn't pick them. It's just like very wild when I give the parameters for what this version is going to be or what it's going to look like, and people are just like, well, you shouldn't have done it. And it's like,
mock draft people are a bit like people who like watch TV for politics. A lot of the time, they're not necessarily looking to be informed. They're more just looking for justifications as to why they're right. And so a lot of the comments on mock draft.
Eric Eager on, but yes, I agree with you.
What was that?
That is why I brought Eric Eager on. I wanted him to prove me right.
Well, yes.
But I do agree with you that people read mock drafts in order to argue and be right.
Yeah, so there's a lot of that going on. For the same reason people hate arguing politics, and the same reasons that people hate going through mock drafts. Like, oh my God, just stop. You're just repeating the same thing that 16 other people who also said, and they were wrong too. Luke Braun asks, so the 2020 draft has to be basically perfect to rescue this offseason. What possible moves are there that the Vikings could make to relieve this pressure?
I mean, they could always trade for players, right? If they traded for some veterans that resolved some needs, that would make it pretty easy. I don't know who's on the trade market at like cornerback or anything like that, because Drake Kirkpatrick was released. But hey, you could sign Darqueze Dennard, you could sign Drake Kirkpatrick, you could sign Jadeveon Clowney. Those are all players that have not signed yet that are available. So that would relieve some pressure. Let's see. I guess if you traded away Anthony Harris, is HaHa Clinton Dix? Is he still with the? Is he still not with the team?
Actually, I believe he signed with the Cowboys.
Fair enough. Mike Daniels hasn't signed with anyone yet, so that's a possibility. There's a couple of veterans that they could sign that I think would relieve a lot of that pressure, and they don't necessarily have to start like Mike Daniels. You would assume would start at 3 technique, which would be fine. But beyond that, I don't think Demarius Randall signed with a team. He's not going to solve any problems at safety, but he is going to create a floor for your depth, which is going to be great. So you could release some pressure by signing those guys. You could always trade for a guy. But I think, in terms of making sure that they can win a bunch in 2020, I don't know that there's a ton of ways to avoid the fact that they absolutely need to nail this draft, that they need to crush, these first couple of picks and get at least 3 starters out of those first 5 picks, maybe even more. I don't think there's a way to avoid it, but you can relieve some pressure by signing some of these veterans.
Next question is from MN Vikings Football, who asks, which QBs are worth trading up for, specifically for Minnesota?
So, if a player falls, between Joe Burrow, Tua Tagovailoa, and Justin Herbert, if one of those players falls, I would be okay trading up. You just heard Eric Eager say he wasn't a huge fan of Justin Herbert, which, I'm fine with. I think that he's not a particularly amazing prospect for somebody that you want to start right away. But I think as a developmental quarterback sitting behind Cousins, there's actually a lot there to like because he's really book smart. It's not showing up on the field. He's inconsistent. His decision making is not all that great. But he's super athletic. He's actually pretty accurate when he's making the right decisions. He's got a great arm. And if you can find ways to, create consistency for him as he develops on the bench, I think you've got a really phenomenal prospect on your hands. So Justin Herbert's somebody that I would trade up for, probably not as much. I wouldn't trade up into the top 10 for him or anything like that, or even the top 12, maybe not even the top 15. But Tua Tagovailoa, if the Vikings like his medicals and they check out, which he had to submit a note from his doctor because teams can't do physicals on their own or do medical rechecks. But if they liked what they saw at the combine during his medical check there, or if they trust kind of that doctor to say the right thing, then obviously trade up for Tua. And then, if Joe Burrow falls to 7, the Vikings should kind of pounce on that like I did in one of the mocks I tweeted out. So those are the guys I'd trade up for. I would not trade up for Jordan Love. I would not trade up in the 3rd round for Jalen Hurts. I would not trade up in the 2nd round for Fromm or Eason or anything like that. So that's probably in the 1st round. Probably Justin Herbert's the most likely player that would fall that I'd be comfortable trading up for.
Next question is from Brian, who asks, is the NFLPA lucky to have taken the deal offered by ownership in that the economic landscape changed wildly only a few days after the CBA was approved?
I don't know who would have had more leverage in later negotiations. I guess, if I think about it, probably the NFL, but nobody got paid today or the past 3 weeks because of the CBA. If the old CBA was in place, I think that they would have been paid the same amount at the same times. So nobody is under any economic pressure to do a deal right now in the same way. But if we're entering an off season where there's just not much practice and there's the looming threat of shortening games or playing games without people in the stands, who gets hurt more by the lack of a deal? I still don't know actually who's better off. I guess the default assumption should just be the people that are best positioned to take a blow to their wallets are also best positioned to create leverage out of a tough economic situation. In both cases, that's the owners. So, I guess the NFLPA is lucky, but I think, honestly, it would have just created a bunch of really weird ripples and unforeseen circumstances that this would have kind of projected out into. So I don't really know who ends up winners as a result of it, but I guess I should default to saying the NFLPA is lucky because the owners couldn't use the fact that they've got greater financial stability at a time without a bunch of economic stability as an advantage.
Next question is from Canary Yellow, who says, Gladney is mentioned a lot. Would the lack of height at corner concern you if we drafted him? Hughes is also under 6 feet. It'd be interesting to know corner scheme fits. It's difficult to look at them on YouTube and not get the all-22.
Yeah, if they drafted Gladney, I think that they would have to make a move somewhere in the middle or later in the draft, which I do in my next upcoming mock draft, actually, to find a taller corner. So I drafted a shorter corner in my most recent mock that I haven't published yet, so it's not Gladney. And later on, I've got an opportunity to take a slot corner or an outside corner, a guy who's 5'9" or a guy who's 6'2". And the guy who's 5'9" fits the Vikings better in terms of what they look for athletically, in terms of his history in different schemes and stuff like that. And I ended up picking the taller guy who's 6'2", just because I'm worried about the matchups that could occur if your entire corner group is under 6 feet tall, which is what would have ended up happening outside of course, like Holton Hill, who, again, we're not super comfortable as ready to start yet. So from a matchup perspective, I want to have a tall guy in there. But I'd say, in the first round, take the best guy. The difference between two guys that you've got ranked like 20 players apart in the fourth round is relatively small. Eric just brought that up and mentioned it. But I think in the first round, I think that there's a significant difference that, you just want to take the more talented guy. Luke Inman recently compared Gladney to Jason Verrett. And if he's 80% of a healthy Jason Verrett, the Vikings just win. So, yeah, it's a concern, but I wouldn't say it's controlling enough to not pick, a player that you really like, at least in this circumstance. I think at some point you have to be comfortable getting some tall guys that can match up against, the Alshon Jeffries of the world. But it would not be one that I would be concerned about. As for the scheme fit question, honestly, the thing about scheme fit for the Vikings is that, you want experience in man, you want experience in zone, you want experience with press. That all helps. But I think from a scheme fit perspective, you want somebody that reads keys quickly. That's the most important thing, is that they understand how a defense changes based on what an offense is doing in real time. That's the most important thing, because the Vikings have had short corners, they've had tall corners, they've had guys experienced in press systems and off systems, and they've all played well. But the important thing is that they figure out what they need to do very quickly, because the scheme can be pretty complex in Minnesota.
Eddie asks a very interesting question. He asks about how the supplemental draft may be affected this year. He asks, will there be a larger pool of eligible players for the supplemental draft this year due to COVID-19?
Yeah, if college decides to shorten their season or eliminate their season, I wouldn't be surprised. So obviously, I would expect the NCAA to grant another year of eligibility, although I think we learned today that's not necessarily the case. I think spring sports for the Ivy League at least don't get eligibility. I think the Big 12 does, and it's conference by conference. But I think for the most part, if college football players miss the college football season, they'll have another year of eligibility, but they don't have another year of life, right? So they need to find a way to maybe get paid. The problem is, if the college football season gets canceled, odds are the NFL season gets canceled. I don't know. Do you pay a supplemental draft player right away? Maybe they get a signing bonus and that'll give them enough for rent and stuff like that. Plus they can do other stuff for work, which they can't necessarily always do as a college football player. I would assume so, but every time I think it through, it seems like the arguments don't always hold up, right? Because you'd expect another year of eligibility, and if they're canceled, then the NFL is canceled, and when do you pay them, and so on and so forth. But it feels right to think that there will be more players entering the supplemental draft in that scenario. Yeah.
Next question is from Margie Lynn, who asks, in light of Kirk's new contract and the Panthers' Teddy signing, which of these two quarterbacks is more likely to make a Super Bowl appearance in the next 3 years?
Teddy or Kirk? I guess does Teddy have a better supporting cast now? That's kind of weird. DJ Moore and Curtis Samuel and somebody else probably.
Christian McCaffrey.
Yeah, C-Mac, I think he's probably a better running back than Dalvin Cook. Plus, he's healthy more often. The offensive line is better. Tougher division, especially now with Tom Brady in it.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that Teddy is on a team that is better designed to take advantage of what he does and produce more points. But because of how difficult that conference is, I think Cousins is more likely to see a Super Bowl. So that's my answer. I think Cousins is more likely to see a Super Bowl if you switched the teams entirely. If it was the Minnesota Panthers and the Carolina Vikings, I think the Minnesota Panthers are more likely to with Teddy. And I think that if you had to choose between the two teams in terms of their likelihood of making it, the Minnesota Vikings or the Minnesota Panthers, I think the Minnesota Panthers have a bit of a better shot, yeah.
Neither team really deserves nice things right now, so. Chris asks, what are your thoughts on Anthony Harris's usage of Twitter versus Diggs? He seems to use vague tweets, but often follows them up with direct and clear responses.
Well, Harris's tweets don't get retweeted into my feed, so clearly doing a lot more to clarify things. From a personal perspective, from just my everyday life perspective, I guess I prefer Anthony Harris's because I don't really have to think about it. But from somebody who wants to drive engagement on Twitter or make jokes or be a reporter or whatever and write about the Vikings, that part of me much prefers Diggs' usage of Twitter, 3,000%. I don't even write clickbait, I guess depending on who you ask. But I don't really write clickbait, and I still love all of these tweets that you can just read whatever into. But I just think, if I don't have to think about it for my personal day-to-day life, that's better for me.
Are we going to do this? I think we have to do it. All right. For those who have not watched Tiger King, now is your chance to stop listening to this show and go do it. Because we are going to end up doing a deep dive on Tiger King, and the next portion will likely have swearing in it. If that's going to offend you and you've seen Tiger King, I don't know what to tell you. You have some priorities that we might need to talk about on another episode.
If you guys house, put on headphones. Let's just
Yeah, this is the headphone portion of today's broadcast, and we're going to talk about Tiger King. We're going to answer the first question on Tiger King, which was from Kane, who asked, "What did Carol Baskin do with the body?"
Well, I mean, doesn't Joe point out that they've got a more acidic stomach than other animals? So
here's my problem.
The body, right?
Here's my problem. He's trying to, I guess, prove that Carol Baskin killed her husband by saying this. The second, while he does work with, or did work with, large cats, I find it difficult to use him as a credible witness on anything at all. I want to believe the fella, but after watching 7 episodes, I don't know what to think about anything involving him.
I will say that from certain domain
if that fry
knowledge,
cook at the end of the show would have told me it, fine. He comes off as credible. Or the guy who lost his legs in the accident that didn't involve tigers, fine. If he told me that, great. If Joe Exotic tells me something, I'm not sure I'm going to believe it, even if I have it even if it's
right. So
yeah,
I would not be shocked if Joe Exotic knew the answer to the question: are tiger stomachs more acidic, and does that increased acidity allow you to say hide a chopped up body? I'm sure he knows the answer to that question. Whether or not he tells you the truth in answering that question is a totally different story.
Yeah.
But I would not be shocked if that was accurate. I was a little weirded out when Carol Baskins later in the documentary was like, "That's not how you kill a guy with a tiger. This is how you kill a guy with a tiger." Like, what? I'm like, what are you doing? The fact that they didn't DNA test the meat grinder was interesting. And if they had just said, "Hey, it would have been impossible. There's like 8,000 different species in there. We would not have been able to figure it out." I would have been like, "All right, fine." And maybe the documentarian didn't include that explanation because they wanted to ramp up the intrigue, which is totally believable because, again, those documentarians kind of were not great people. But it does. I'm just like, what's happening? I don't know. But I do think I think it's the Tigers. I feel like it's just the most obvious thing. It's got to be the Tigers.
I'm still of the belief that I wouldn't believe anything that came out of Joe Exotic's mouth, even if he had his lip notarized. But I can't. It's.
What else do you think? Do you think he actually flew away?
No. That's the thing is that I don't believe that he flew away. I don't know if he ended up in the septic tank, which is still one of my favorite scenes in the whole thing.
That is super funny.
Carol, let me out of the septic tank.
Yeah, I always forget about the septic tank theory, which is pretty specific. It could be anywhere. It doesn't have to be under a septic tank. But the tiger theory, that's natural. If you're running a big cat reserve, why wouldn't you use
what you
the
have?
Big cat?
Yeah, why don't you use that? What's at your advantage, or what's at your disposal, rather? Yeah, I don't.
Right word.
Yeah, that's. I don't know. Ugh. Also, can you say Carol Baskin with your best Joe Exotic impression?
I think I could do a great Carol Baskin, but I think I could do some sentences. Carol Baskin. No, that's just a generic Southern accent. I can't do it.
It's more of a curl than a Carol. Carol Baskin, otherwise known as that bitch in Florida.
Yeah, I am gay. I'm broke as shit. I got a judgment against me, some bitch down in Florida. I will not change the way I dress.
Joe Exotic 2016.
So the fact that he ran for president and they kept that in reserve until the 4th episode, remarkable.
I like that he won a significant portion of the Oklahoma gubernatorial race.
So I think he won a significant portion of the Oklahoma libertarian gubernatorial. I think he got 19% of the libertarian vote. I don't think he got 19% of the Oklahoma vote. I gotta look this up.
While you're doing that, one of the most underrated portions for me of the entire show was the reveal that an employee had their arm ripped off, and that he was offering the if you guys want to leave, you can leave. We can do a rain check, or we can have you guys come in a different day. I'm gonna go smoke the cigarette though. And he's hanging out in the EMS outfit. Really? You just happen to have that? Or you just happen to an employee got hurt. Well, I better grab my EMS. I better grab my EMS jacket.
It was wild to me because, and by the way, it was 19% of the libertarian primary. Okay. So he did not, it was 660 votes. He did not place in the actual election, which actually that would have been amazing. Yeah, what was wild to me is that they were only doing the interviews in tight shots, and then when it was revealed that the employee was missing their hand, they just zoom out, and you're oh, there's no hand. Oh my god!
Now we should say that I have watched it one time, and I watched it with my wife, and you watched it twice. Once on Google Hangout with your brother just to catch his reactions and get screenshots of them.
Yeah, incredible. He hadn't watched it. He said he didn't want to, but then he got kind of bullied into it. Not by me, by the way. And once I learned he was watching it, we're like, all right, we got to watch it together. And he'd already watched like the first 2 episodes. So we do a Zoom, kind of what everyone's doing now, watch along. And it was incredible because I could just screenshot his reactions. And when the Walmart meat truck like happened, like my brother is like very fastidious. Like he is really into making sure everything's clean. He wants to make sure that, you're not serving like gross food or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. Like that's a thing he cares a lot about. And when it was like all of this expired meat, and then it all just gets dumped in a bin, and then the accumulated liquids that had like dripped off the meat are also dripping back onto the expired meat. He was just not having a good time for some reason, so I had to screenshot that. But the best part, I think, was, and I tried screenshotting this, but my computer wasn't cooperating. But the best part was a couple episodes later where they reveal that he is a pizza restaurant.
Yeah.
And then they're like, by the way, the pizza restaurant might have the expired meat in it. We don't know, but like, it's probable.
My wife lost her mind at the expired meat pizza. We had to stop. We were dying laughing at that. Like, oh no. And when they had the big like Thanksgiving feast at the same time, like shortly around the same time, like, oh no,
my God,
don't
worry.
Do not touch those turkeys. Do not. You don't. Oh, you're all gonna get trichinosis.
Yeah.
God.
It's just how the Thanksgiving. Like, I don't know how many of those people were like familiar with how he fed the tigers, but also like, would it have mattered because like a number of the employees just like took the meat for themselves on their own, right? And it's like free food and they don't make a ton of money, so I get it. So, but like, would they have cared? But also, like, Walmart's not throwing out turkeys during Thanksgiving. He's clearly serving turkey. So, like, maybe it wasn't expired meat. I don't know, man. This is not a question that should have to be asked in the first place.
I'm just saying, if you bring your if you're an employee and you bring your family to the feast there, and you've handled the meat and everything, and you know how they feed people at the restaurant, I'm just saying you don't take your family there. But if you had that sort of sense, you probably wouldn't be working for Joe Exotic for pennies an hour anyway.
Yeah, that's true.
As it turns out, the thing the two things that we really learned from this were that A, you can buy a tiger for like $2,000, and 2, we learned that if you want to have if you're hiring employees to be around said tiger, you apparently don't have to pay them a damn thing.
Yeah, I guess not. That was very wild.
Also, we learned that you can you can still be smoking a cigarette while filling up a gas canister.
You did say don't try this at home, which I think makes him the most responsible person on the documentary.
A handful of people came off okay in that. One of which happened to have been the drug dealer from Miami, who very casually explained how he and an associate had murdered a federal informant and then cut him up with a bandsaw and then proceeded to cremate his remains. I like how he came off as the most likable person in actually, maybe not him as the most likable. I think his wife, with her obsession about putting monkeys in kids' clothes, I think she came off the best in the entire documentary. But my wife is sitting here just we had to pause it so she could look up some stuff from like work about what happens with bandsaws and people, and she's like, oh my God, why would you do that? That would be no. Like, do you realize how long it would take to do that? To sit and like how you'd probably have to go out to home, how you'd have to go out to like Home Depot or something and get another blade in order to finish the job? Like the perseverance, the amount of Adderall it would take to focus on doing something like this.
Sorry, I have to know this for work.
Yeah, so
enter.
These databases exist of like what happens with this hits bone or whatever. So there was some Googling. I didn't look at her phone, but I know that's what she was doing.
Incredible, man. I can't. You are so screwed.
There are certain things. Yeah, well, I know what I signed on for. It's fine.
But yeah, I mean, the guy, he was like, yeah, I think they based Scarface off of me, and I think that's true.
Some portion of it has to be.
Right. And it's like, yeah, he like burned a DEA agent's remains, and I think my favorite part of that, and again, this guy came off as likable. My favorite part of that was when the guy was like, well, I mean, I wasn't the one who, like, killed him, but what was I supposed to tell the jury? Your Honor, I didn't put a saw to his throat. Like, yeah, that's exactly what you're supposed to tell the jury. What are you doing? Yeah, obviously that's what you're supposed to tell the jury. What? Are you like, they wouldn't have believed me? Like, you probably should try. What the hell, man?
He came off much more likable than the guy who was riding an elephant through part of town over to like, to bathe in the river or the reserve, like the water reserve or whatever. He came off so much more likable than that guy.
Right? Incredible.
So, I haven't shared this with you yet, I don't believe. So, I am going to send this to you through our chat, and I can get your reaction from it. So, what I did was, immediately after she and I finished it, because we just sat and we killed it in one day.
Yeah.
I think we started in the early afternoon, and then we stopped for a little bit to like make the kids dinner or whatever, and then told them, stay out of our room. You cannot watch this. This is not something you need to witness. So what I did was I told Dusty, you have to watch this. You have to watch this now. It's like, well, I'm sorry, what? So I am sending you a screenshot of the chat that I had with Dusty, and this was his reaction to it. Yeah, his response. I was like, Tiger King on Netflix. Like, immediately. Now. It's like, oh, really? It has everything you could ask for. If anything, the description Netflix has on it undersells in it. A couple hours later, what the hell am I watching? And then there's a picture of James Harden.
The 18 minutes in the first episode, Rashad was like, what have you all asked me to do? This is nuts. 18 minutes in, Rashad, everyone else is like, Rashad, you're 0% in.
Yeah.
This is an exponential graph, which you have become very familiar with over the past couple of weeks.
Obviously.
It gets wilder.
Like, listen, if this were the Lord of the Rings movies, you're like 2 minutes into the intro.
Right. They're still explaining what a ring is. Like, honestly, you're not close.
Sauron hasn't even lost it yet.
There's a murder plot, and it's not even the murder plot that's the focus of the show. You're not even at the first murder plot yet. Okay, Rashad? So just sit down and have, apparently, a lot of wine.
Well, that was the thing. We had hit the 5th episode, and my wife said to me, I was like, what the hell is going to happen in this? Like, how does this thing end? And I was like, I reminded her that the description, like, there's a murder for hire thing. It's like, oh my God, I forgot that was like, there was so many things going on that we forgot what the plot was supposed to be about. Like, right.
And it's like, and they still find ways to like introduce new characters basically every episode.
Yes.
And I'm like, why are we talking to like this random handyman that worked for Jeff Lowe, who we haven't even talked about any, who worked for Jeff Lowe and didn't like Joe Exotic. Like, who cares about this guy? And he's the hitman. Like, he's the guy. What the? Oh, it all comes back together. why is he talking? Why is he talking on camera about this? And it turns out, like, he tried to work out an immunity deal. It looks like everybody doesn't know how contracts work, but I guess no one's probably anyway, which he's probably pretty lucky about. But, like, holy crap, like, we didn't even... Jeff Lowe, the guy who, like, from the very beginning was clearly running an I'm Rich scam. Like, as soon as he showed up in the Ferrari, I'm like, oh, he rented that. I remember, like, as soon as he showed up, I said he rented that. And then Joe was like, yeah, then we went to his mansion, and it was so big, and I was like, he definitely rented that mansion. You know how I know? Because Ty Lopez does the exact same thing when he runs these YouTube ads about how much he loves knowledge more than his Lamborghinis. Like, it's the same grift. Like, he's not rich, he just pretends to be rich by having a little bit of money and knowing how to make it look like he has a ton of money. And then that's exactly what fucking happened. Like, oh my God.
And I still think that the skeeziest thing that Jeff Lowe was involved in had nothing to do with the, hey, come have sex with my wife and I, and you can play with the tigers thing. That wasn't it. The skeeziest thing that he was involved in wasn't even Joe Exotic. It was talking about how his wife, or his girlfriend probably, was about to pop out a kid. And like right after the kid was, yep, and then she's going to go right back to the gym. I'm just like, oh, dude.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my God. That guy and his like, underage sex cult?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, my God. It doesn't need to be said, but, like, screw that guy. That guy is, like, the worst. Yeah, 2 murder for hire or 2 murder plots, and, like, the one person who's not involved in either of them is, like, the worst person on the show.
No, the kid thing. The kid thing was Jeff Lowe.
Oh, that's right. Oh, yeah. My God, they all suck. The kid. And like she was like sometimes comfortable and sometimes uncomfortable.
Yes.
With the way that, because like when he was like, oh yeah, you gotta have a little pussy in order to get a lot of pussy, and she was like, yeah, but then she was like so totally down with like other random stuff, and then he almost got eaten by a lion on TV. Like, oh my God, there's so much stuff.
I read somebody on Twitter saying that you see somebody like Jeff Lowe in Florida all the time, and if you don't know anybody like Jeff Lowe in Florida, you are Jeff Lowe in Florida. Like
incredible.
who drives me by some bitch in Florida?
Who drives a Ferrari on a dirt road like that? Like, that's just nuts to me. Like, there's no, it's not even a dirt road. There's no road. You're just driving it on uneven ground and grass, and it's a sports car, so it's got a super low carriage.
Yep.
What the hell, man?
Somebody who's renting it. Somebody who doesn't care. Somebody who is not going to be. God. Yeah, that. Oh, I had a lot of fun with that. And Doc, the
Bhagavan.
Oh,
his name is Bhagavan.
Doc Bhagavan.
Definitely the name that he was born with. Yeah. What does Bhagavan mean? Oh, it means Lord. You know, he just calls himself that and makes everyone else call him that.
No,
totally
it's not
normal.
Lord. It's close to God, friend of God.
You're right. Yeah, that's totally normal behavior.
Just like the multiple, wives with. See, he at least wasn't marrying the girls, as opposed to Joe Exotic, who had an actual wedding ceremony to have a 3-way marriage.
That might be better though, because like he's like, okay, if you want to be one of my sister wives, you have to live in a stall with cockroaches and poop, and like I'll throw you some bread, and that bread will have cockroaches in it too, and then you can work your way up to being a sister wife. You show up when you're like 15, 16, and you live in a stall, and from there you'll improve your condition. I think that's worse. Like I think marrying gives them like too much power. Like none of these marriages are legal, right? But like, I think if they do get married, it just kind of puts them on an equal footing that he's just not comfortable with. Whereas with like Joe, yeah, he's using like addictive substances to like string along his husband's, which is also not good. But like at least he was like, yeah, we love each other and we're married. Like that's something.
I had this moment during the gay wedding where there was the three people were getting married and everything. I just yelled out, "This is what the Republicans warned us about in 2004."
Right. Nailed it.
We had this odd moment when watching the show. Early, it must have been the first episode where he's got all the piercings and he's got the one eyebrow piercing that looks like it's trying to leave his face. Mm-hmm. And my wife just said aloud, is like, he totally has a he totally has a dick piercing. There's no way. He totally has one.
Called it.
And so a couple episodes later, like sixth episode or whatever, they talk about the piercing he has, and she just screams, "Oh my God, I called that!"
And the padlocks.
Yes. Like that was a personal highlight for me. She was so like, "I totally called that." And the and the guy getting shot too. It's like, "Oh no. Nope, he's on camera. Oh, here it 30 seconds of silence."
Yeah, like that episode, I was like, at the beginning of that episode, I was like, hey, the one person they haven't interviewed is Travis. Huh, right, it was Travis, right, I think. That's interesting. Oh God, I bet something happened to him. And like, as that episode progresses, they like talk about him more and more. Because again, they hadn't started talking to us at the beginning of that episode that I thought that. They talk about it more and more. I'm like, oh my God, we're going to find out, aren't we? Because he's not on camera. And then they talk about him having a gun, and I'm like, oh God, at least he wasn't eaten by a tiger. But I'm not like sure what happens, because the way the libertarian political campaign manager, what a weird thing to include in this tiger documentary, described it, made it seem like he was trying to prove that there weren't bullets left in the gun, mm-hmm. But like everybody else was talking about it like he was depressed, and clearly he was like working through some stuff. I don't know if he was like capital D depressed. Very weird. Probably should have put a trigger warning in the show. It just kind of happened and none of us were prepared for it. Weird. And then 30 seconds of silence.
Yes.
That guy saw it happen. Oh my God.
Ugh. Yeah, there was a lot of just stuff there that was just ugh. Yeah, so in addition to all of that, the we haven't even talked about Carol Baskins yet. The dynamic that she and her now husband have is, I mean, I'm glad they're happy. I really am.
Really do seem very happy, and that's good. Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot written online since the show that the show didn't do a really good job kind of demonstrating that Big Cat Rescue is actually separate from all these private zoos, and they actually do a bunch of nonprofit work.
And don't pay them and have like armies of people who just work for free.
Yeah, that's the part that really bothered me. But if I'm choosing between like hordes of animal abuse and volunteer/labor exploitation, I guess it's the volunteer exploitation. I think that doesn't seem as bad. It's all bad. I don't want to like sugarcoat it. Like, pay your employees. They're like working hours. It's very weird. And they do apparently, as a nonprofit, have like full-time employees, right? They're like work, $30,000-$60,000 a year.
Yeah.
But like they have a lot of employees that like don't make any money, and you got to do this for like years before you work your way up to another employee who doesn't make any money. Very weird. But I guess they do genuine animal rights work. The show probably should have done more to explain the distinction between what she does and the private zoos that they run. Because it really just felt like they were all the same, and she was using the law as a cudgel, but it didn't make sense because the way they were describing the law, they didn't really tell us why she thought she would be exempt from it. It was all very bizarre.
as opposed to parts of this that were, not. I liked the fact that he blew up his recording area, and
So yeah, we agree that he did it, right? That Joe did it.
oh, Joe totally did that, and the poor crocodilians that were in there.
Oh my God, Michael Jackson crocodiles.
Yep, the poor crocodilians went away. The fact that they were referred to as crocodilians made us just almost.
It was
Oh God. I just felt so. You feel initially, you feel bad for the guy who is trying to sell this as a reality show. You almost feel bad for him a little bit. And the more I was reading about this, and there's a great Twitter thing from a guy by the name of Robert Moore.
Robert Moore? Yeah, I've got it up.
Yeah,
I'll link it in the show notes.
Yep. Robert Moore has this great Twitter feed Twitter exchange where he's discussing his history with it. He spent 4 years working on a podcast and a long magazine story about Joe and Carol. He even spent a week living at the zoo. So,
oh my gosh.
So he has all of these things going on in it, and it's just like, my favorite is the point here in 2005. He goes, one of the tweets is number 7. It goes, one night in 2015 rather, Joe and I were walking through Walmart when a portly bespectacled young gay guy walked up, shook Joe's hand, and thanked Joe for being the only out and proud gay man for many miles when he was growing up. That kid was Joe Dial. He who is the guy who later ran Joe's campaign.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
Like that's how he meets people, and apparently he ended up being the manager of Walmart, or one of the managers, and was responsible for the food that was getting out to the things where they're just getting thrown out. And so when he got fired and caught for that, that's when Joe hired him on.
Okay.
So, I mean, he knew he could trust him with the food thing, I guess. So I trust
us. But yeah.
All Walmart managers have expertise in running in how I should run for governor. So
it was his dream job.
Yes.
Which I feel bad about, but it didn't really seem like he was going to have a lot of options. So I guess it's good that I don't know how to feel about it.
He didn't come off well. He came off as somebody who needed therapy after all.
Oh yeah, he needed therapy. But I'm just saying, if your dream job is to run a political campaign and you're in the position that he's in, do you, at the conclusion of the political campaign, the things he saw aside, say that was worth it or not worth it? And I have no idea, because he said it was the campaign from hell, or it was a nightmare or something like that. But also he got to at least do the thing, kind of. He probably wouldn't have been able to do it, so I have no idea.
It's another monkey's paw situation. That's all it is.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You got what you wanted. Also, you had to deal with Joe Exotic. But the guy that they were filming, Rick Kirkham, the one who was directing all of the Joe TV spots and everything. One of the Robert Moore things was number 11. Before meeting Joe, he had made a film about his addiction to crack cocaine. And after the zoo fire, Rick moved to Dallas, and then his house mysteriously burned down, almost killing him. And he just fled the country after that. And
goodness.
And if that happened to me, if my nest egg, my retirement exploded and took out some crocodiles with it, and then I moved to Dallas, and then my house started on fire there, and if I had nothing to do with it, I'd yeet myself out of the country. I would get myself out. I want to get an ocean between me and Joe Exotic.
Yeah, I would. That makes sense.
God. I'm trying to think what we haven't talked about here. I
probably most of the show. He was slow what happened.
There's way too much. This a true deep dive on this would have to be per episode or something. This was just insanity. on every level. I loved it. It just kept going deeper. It just kept getting crazier. And the best thing about what's going on right now is so many people have seen it. I went to the chiropractor, and the old woman, conservative person working at the front desk asked me about it. Like, everyone has seen it because everyone has enough time to sit down and deep dive it. Like,
no, it was number one trending in the United States, right ahead of like Contagion.
yes.
Right? Like, goodness.
And it was funny because I told my wife 2 days before we watched it, I was like, hey, a bunch of people are talking about this. I didn't know the topic yet. Hey, a bunch of people are talking about this. Do you want to sit and watch it? And I thought it was like one episode. And so when I saw it was like 47, 48 minutes, we sat down and we watched the first episode, and we're like, oh God, how many of these are there? Oh my God, they're set well. Let's see how good the second one is. And the second one was even better. And it ended with the thing about Carol Baskin possibly killing her husband. Like, all right, well, we're
can't end there.
This train ain't stopping, so let's keep going. Just insane. It takes you for a ride. It definitely does that. Well, let's wrap up the rest of the mailbag here. Don from Ohio asks, Arif, does the NFL play an entire season in 2020? What will teams average for attendance if social distancing is no longer in place? Is 70% capacity a reach?
Yeah, so I asked Eric some of those questions or versions of those questions, and he answered them pretty well. But I think my ultimate answer is that they do play a season in 2020. I would not be shocked if some of those games did not have any attendance. But I think when it gets to the point where there's going to be attendance, they're going to be full up because people are just going to really absolutely want to go when they feel like they've got license to go. Because I think people's fear of catching, COVID-19 or the coronavirus or SARS-CoV-2 or whatever you want to call it, their fear of catching it is clearly not as great as their desire to do stuff outside the house, which actually I think is totally understandable. But like, people were warned not to do stuff, but until they were explicitly disallowed from doing stuff, that didn't happen. So I think if you are allowed to go to an NFL game, I think they'll pack up, and I think that you could jack up prices fivefold and still sell out. So I think that once there are, stadiums that you can fill, they'll absolutely be filled.
It's going to be interesting to see what ends up happening out of all of this, if it turns an entire generation or two into germaphobes after this, or if this is something that, like, when people come out of this, are they going to be still? Because I've been out in public since this has happened, just between my doctor's office and the chiropractor and back home, and no one's looking at each other. So I wonder how long it's going to take before people are kind of like acknowledging each other again, or if it's going to be a situation where like the door's open and like, oh my God, I want to lick everyone's face at this point. I just get close enough to like human beings again.
I think people will be really close with their friends and maybe a little bit further estranged from strangers than they were before.
Yeah, it's odd. Next question from Don from Ohio is also, did Carol Baskins contact James to have his stepson kill her husband and make the body disappear? This is the only logical solution.
Makes sense. You gonna answer it?
What year did that happen? Because I'm confident he wasn't alive.
That's a good point, actually. I'm pretty sure he wasn't.
Yeah, so not a thing. When are you guys going to do a live show? It makes so much sense to do it now with no sports. Have another watch along, but this time live and answering questions while we are all in quarantine. This is perfect. This seems like Patreon. This seems like Patreon stuff right here.
It's true.
Oh God, we didn't do an April Fool's thing because there's days don't matter at this point, and so putting out an April Fool's joke thing just seems dumb right now.
It really does just seem remarkably stupid.
My employer put something out as like just a completely throwaway thing in an email that was titled important updates. And I was like really upset for a moment there because I just sat there, you know what? Fine. It was dumb and innocuous and it didn't really matter, but I was like still bothered. Like, really? That's what we're doing? You're putting an April Fool's Day joke in an email that says important updates for something that has closed you? Really? But yeah, it seemed in poor taste this year, so we might have to talk about doing something like that. If Arif had an exotic zoo, what animals would he have, and when do we expect his country album to come out? Also, I would pay a ton to see Arif in a mullet.
That's not happening. What exotic animals out there? Probably primates. They seem cool. They're also potentially more dangerous than big cats, but they just seem so cool.
And probably they wouldn't attack you if you had cologne sprayed on your feet, which is apparently a thing.
Who knows?
I love that as an explanation. That's why the tigers attacked him, because they sprayed cologne on his feet.
And they engaged in very unlikely behavior for a tiger in that they attacked a human. Oh yeah.
I forget which comedian it was. Like, they didn't go rogue; they went tiger. Like,
yeah.
God, just misery. Shout out to Don from Ohio, who is in personal hell at the moment for just destroying his back. He's not having a good time right now. So if you ever wanted to make fun of Don from Ohio and get a response from him on Twitter, now is the time, because he has nothing better to do with his time than answer trolls. So you're welcome, Don. I'm just trying to give you something to do while your back recovers. Final question is from Beef Brewski, who asks, you are on the run with Zimmer and Bob Dylan, presumably writing another 20-minute song about JFK, during the impending zombie apocalypse. You have a spot in your vehicle for one more passenger. You happen upon professional wrestler New Jack and Joe Exotic. Both are begging to join your ragtag gang. Who do you invite and why? Also, your trunk is filled with beef jerky, 2 bottles of expired Clamato, 5 cases of Red Bull, a medieval flail-type weapon, and a completely filled-out Subway Stamp Club stamp card.
Great. You're much more qualified to answer this question than I am. I can't imagine saying yes to Joe Exotic.
So, I'm assuming you don't know who New Jack is.
I Googled him before the show, and it was not crazy enlightening, no.
Okay, so here's who New Jack is/was. He's still alive. In defiance of, like, natural laws, New Jack is alive. He is the subject of a documentary that just came out on Vice called Dark Side of the Ring. It's about an hour long, and they chronicle his professional life and a little bit of his childhood. New Jack was a wrestler that was popular in Smoky Mountain Wrestling and ECW back in the 90s and early 2000s. And New Jack was famous because when he'd go on the mic, he would just say anything. At one point, when he first started, it was just after O.J. Simpson had killed in quotations due to legal reasons, was just accused of killing his ex-wife and her boyfriend. And he went on TV and was like doing a black supremacist gimmick and said something along the lines of, just want to put a shout out to my boy O.J. Simpson. Good work, 2 less we have to worry about.
Goodness.
And said this on TV in Kentucky, in Tennessee. And he would just go on the mic and say just absolutely crazy things. And so when he went to ECW, he just became like a trash wrestler where he would just be beating up people with like random weapons. And he's like certifiably insane. The things he would get himself into, as far as like, he would like jump from 15, 20 feet up onto a table, like to break, to go through the table with somebody. He would do big dives with like giant people he was fighting. He stabbed people in the ring multiple times and went to jail, or at least went to court twice over attempted murder charge or like attempted manslaughter charges. He'd be entertaining, to say the very least.
You're still describing someone that I am not confident is necessarily more dangerous to have in a party than Joe Exotic. Like, yeah, multiple manslaughter charges. He was doing, he was willing to say kind of anything. And I'm just thinking, like, yeah, but is he just going to, like, fire a gun in my face just to prove that, he has a gun? Because, I mean, Joe Exotic did that on camera and then just angled the gun up right at the last second. That was cool. I don't want to deal with that. I guess he has guns that's useful in a zombie apocalypse. Is he going to turn them on me? Maybe. Is he going to try to adopt a zombie? Good chance. So I'm still thinking New Jack.
Well, yeah, and as far as the whole thing goes, like, he'd be an interesting person to have around, but I'm trying to think of like a reason that he would be useful. Unless your whole point was, I need to find cocaine, because he was really good at finding cocaine. Like, he'd see, like, people would like accuse him of being on drugs, like after the fact, like, you were high for all your matches, and you go, yeah, I was on cocaine the whole time. Why do you think I jumped off, 20-foot roofs with people? Like, this was something I did. Why would people think that I was sober for any of this? I never said I was sober for any of this. It's almost like the whole Charles Barkley thing, like, I am not a role model. So I just sent you a link to what's referred to as the Danbury Fall. And he purposefully did that to someone. The story was that he had been wronged by a guy, by the guy that he tosses here. And it was difficult. Like, he ended up cracking his skull and like losing all the sight in his like right eye and couldn't hear, and he gets headaches and everything. So his revenge was basically to try to kill the guy. And he tried to do that in the video clip I just sent you. So yeah, fun stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know if New Jack is worth having along in your crew. He'd be entertaining, but somebody would say something to him and he would like potentially snap. Whereas Joe, but I still don't know if he's a better person to have around you than Joe Exotic. Joe Exotic might try to convince you that you're not straight with a bag of meth.
Yeah, that's not helpful.
Like, there's no real positive. Do we have to pick them up? Can we just keep driving at this point? Like,
do you get all of Joe Exotic's guns? That's like really important.
I don't know if he still has them. Can we get all of Jeff's guns?
Oh yeah, do that. Yeah, that's probably not gonna.
I did like that. That of all things to happen at the end, the zoo that they were making at the very end, like, it completely fell apart. Like, the deal completely fell apart.
Oh,
like,
yeah. It's like, Jeff, none of your deals have worked out. What's the common denominator here, man?
Yeah. Everyone in Florida knows a guy like that. God. All right. So that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. We will be back soon with more non-Tiger King related content, probably. I mean, we'll see if there's more Tiger content.
There's more Tiger King content available to have.
There might be more Tiger King content than draft stuff. Who knows? But the draft is still scheduled for the same days, so there's that. I think Roger Goodell is just really excited to be doing the draft without being booed. Like, I feel like the responsible thing for like Rich Eisen and everybody else to do is, as soon as he comes on the screen, to just boo him the first time. Just make sure that audio ends up just staying on the screen, but whatever. Arif, what do you have to plug?
Yeah, I've got a mock draft up at The Athletic that people seem to really dislike. I will have another mock draft that incorporates a lot of that feedback into, into what I'm doing. So be sure to check that out, but read the first one so you can see why I made some of the decisions I made in the second one that's going to be published on Monday.
So what you're saying is what's going to happen for that first one that you did is going to be what actually ends up working out for like all the teams then. The one that everyone hates. Yeah.
Yeah, the one that everyone hates is probably the good one, yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, so that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you'd like to donate to the show, you can go to patreon.com/NorseCode or paypal.me/NorseCode as well. For Reef, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening, and please remember to bring your wine towel. And we'll be back soon.
Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.